Welcome to the Leadership Unscripted podcast, where we explore the challenges that business leaders have to address when change happens in the real world. Every business will face disruption sooner or later, and how corporate leadership responds to these changes to cost structures, technology, competition, customer behavior is critical to their long-term success. My name is James McNabb.
And I'm Ian Giles.
And today, we're looking at what business leadership needs to do to create sustainability. When we talk about sustainability, we often talk about the changes and investments society needs to make today to ensure we have a long and prosperous future. Things like limiting the environmental impact of human activity, ensuring tolerance for divergent views across politics, religions, and cultures, and issues of energy security, transportation, infrastructure, global partnerships all play a role in ensuring a positive future for all of us. Today, we're looking at sustainability in business and the decisions leaders need to make to ensure ongoing success within an enterprise. And I think we're going to look at X, I guess it is now, as a real world example. There's lots that's happened over the last couple of years of Twitter, and much of it's quite public. So it's a great case study to dig into. When I talk about sustainability, I'm really talking about the sustainability of the business enterprise itself, at the corporation or partnership or the operational entity. A business proper is really the operation of a business model. And of course, one business entity could have multiple business models, and the business model can change over time. For example, if you're a farmer and you're growing grain, you sell the grain to whatever distributor that takes the grain and sells it to manufacturers or product manufacturers and so forth. You have a business model. It's a grain growing and resale business model. Now, if the grain became hard to produce, environmental factors, costs, or what have you, or there was no more demand for that grain, your business model would start to evaporate. So you could pivot and change which products that you're marketing. So you could change from grain to corn, for example. It becomes much more difficult for an operation like that to change to something that's dramatically different, like, say, a telecom company. You're not going to see a farmer make that kind of shift because it's just too far. In a lot of cases, what we're seeing in business today is businesses facing this kind of existential crisis and not being sure how to handle it. In a lot of cases, there's the illusion of stability, the illusion of ongoing success, but a lot of the building blocks that are necessary to ensure that success continues really aren't in place. And if they're not in place, it means that sooner or later, that business is going to run out of road. What's become kind of interesting with a lot of startups is the fact that they often don't have a revenue or profitability model when they start. Twitter is a great example of this. When it was founded, there was a pretty clear declaration that they did not have a clear view to how they were going to generate revenue or become profitable. And I thought, well, they started in 2006. So I started digging into some of the research for this. I'm going to ask you a question. When do you think, I know you probably haven't done the research here, when do you think they became profitable?
I'm going to guess maybe 2012.
Seems like a reasonable guess, right? Well, it was 2018. So it had been in business for 12 years before it crossed the marker of profitability. And up till then, it was running on investor dollars. And obviously, it did have some revenue coming into it. But 2018 was the first year, according to their public financial statements, that they actually made money. So get this, that first year, it generated $1.2 billion in profit against roughly $3 billion in overall revenues, which is a whopping 40% profit margin. Sounds good, right?
Yeah.
The next year in let me go back a little bit before that, before I go forward. In 2017, they lost $100 million. And in 2016, they lost nearly $500 million. So this is starting to look like, well, we're losing money, and we get the hockey stick, right? All of a sudden, we're in profitability. Okay, so we get into 2019 and 2020. So where do you think their revenues went from there? Let me rephrase that. I'll tell you what their revenues were. You tell me what you think their profitability was. So 3.5 billion in 2019 and 3.7 billion in revenue in 2020. What do you think they did for profitability over those years?
What was the profit on that revenue?
In both of those
And you're saying
years,
they're profitable.
Well, that's their revenue. They managed in both of those years and 2021 to lose money.
So they weren't profitable in any of those years.
Yeah,
That was the revenue, and they weren't profitable. And you said they were running
They had 1 year, 2018, where they made 1.2 million, and I'm actually just going to pull up their financials here. So if we look at 2019, they actually did make pretty good money. They did almost 1.5 million. 2020 though, they lost 1.1 million, and 2021 they lost 200 million.
That's surprising.
Sorry, not 1.1 million. That was 1.1 billion they lost in 2020 and 200 million in 2022. So we've got a business that never made money until 2018. They made 1.2 billion that year. They did like almost 1.5 the next year, and they sank right back down into a heavy cost structure. Now, to be fair, in 2021, there was a fairly heavy duty. In 2021, there was a fairly substantial cost structure of about $700 million in legal fees. I think we know where that came from. The revenues did go up substantially from 3 billion to 5 billion over that course of 2018 to 2021. Their sales costs, which is of course what was driving those, were another big increase in costs. So they spent money to go and sell. They got the revenue in, but the cost structure didn't add up. It didn't work out. So we're looking at a business that really has not yet emerged as a sustainable operation. You know, we see a business that has like 2 years of good profitability, and then it completely falls apart for the next couple of years and eats up almost all of the profitability it made in the former years. It's just quite substantial.
What surprises me is the timing, because it's right around COVID, and companies like Meta and Google were highly profitable because everything had gone online at that point. And so for them, it was the perfect storm for them to make money, and Twitter lost money. Now, I don't know in comparison what they look like, putting them side by side, but in what you've researched, does it explain at all what might have caused those losses?
Yeah, it's cost structure.
The cost structure.
Every year you can see their cost structure increasing. So their cost of goods sold, where they're, in this case, operating costs, became
their operating costs
far too expensive. So I mentioned, of course, in 2021, they had $700 million in legal fees, but they also had a growing cost of sales. And the cost of sales itself against the sales was okay, but it wasn't enough to sustain the whole operation.
And so when did Elon Musk buy it?
I believe it went through in mid-2022.
2022, okay.
Yeah.
And now what's the cost structure look like since he's bought it?
So he bought it. It's private.
Oh, right. So
right?
We don't
So
see it.
We only have public records for the years that it was a public company. In 2022, there was a kind of partial year that they published, but it would have been the time before Elon picked it up. Okay. And once he had it, that's when he started making changes.
Right. And I remember interviews early after he bought it, and some of the things he was talking about was they had way too much office space in prime real estate locations and way too much staff. So
exactly,
which speaks to your operational costs. So
here's the interesting thing. You know, what I'm curious about, I don't know, you know, you've been following Elon Musk as well, and maybe not Twitter as closely, but his overall operations. I am curious, and I want to know what you think, whether or not he sees this as a business he actually wants to own in the long term. Or, so keep this in mind, he spent $44 billion to buy it. So that's like, 40 plus times its most profitable year. So he'd really have to own this for 40 years to get his return out of it, which is, if it continued to that point, or it has to grow quite dramatically and become consistently profitable. Or you strip it down to its bare bones, you keep it operating, you have strong financials for a few years, and then you flip it and you sell it to somebody else. And I don't know which direction he's going here. I don't know. We haven't seen a lot of this kind of activity from him in the past, although, he obviously has made a series of exits. He's also merged, I forget the name of his solar power company, he merged into Tesla at one point. It was a separate entity, and then it became kind of, entangled, so he pulled that inside. But it's a very interesting challenge. Now, the other part of this I wonder about, and if you were harvesting, for example, so I should digress a little bit briefly. Harvesting is when you buy a business and your goal is really only to get a relatively short-term return on your investment out of that business, after which you don't really care what happens to it. If it continues to generate some profitability, great. If not, you could shut it down or sell it. Either are acceptable outcomes. But one of the things you do when you're doing this is you run as thin a team as possible. You do not invest in R&D. And you really focus on just trying to drive revenue and profitability from the business you already have, as opposed to trying to evolve it or continue to develop it and ensure that it's sustainable for the long term. And so when his first move was to let 6,500 employees go, he went from 8,000 employees down to about 1,500, and he did it fairly abruptly and very soon after he acquired it. I mean, that sends a signal. And his comment to the media was, well, it turns out if you don't have an ideology or a political viewpoint you're trying to push, and you just want to allow free speech, you don't need 8,000 people.
Right.
But I'm not sure I totally buy that. I don't know if that passes muster in your mind, because I kind of question whether or not that's a reasonable way to approach this, because I'm pretty sure 6,500 people were not just in the business of enforcing, rules on content on the system.
Mm-hmm. Well, I want to be careful with what I say, because it's not. I'm not looking at the facts. I'm going by my memory of what I've read through this, and with regards to the first thing that he wanted to tackle was profitability. And I remember when he came into the company, and there was even that point in time when they're negotiating where he said that with the new information that he asked for, that he was shocked at the losses. And so I think the first thing he wanted to do was cut costs to make the business stable. And so I remember in one interview that he said that he had righted the ship, that it was that the cost cutting and layoffs had made the company, they weren't losing money. I don't think he was saying that they were profitable, but they weren't losing money like what you stated their financials were. So that, I think, was clearly the main agenda, was to try and make this not bleed so much money. I just personally, in reading what I've read, I think that was the main decision in what he was doing. The other thing is, and I was watching this on 60 Minutes, and they're talking about China, and they're talking about how social media works in China and how the state is monitoring, like literally post by post, what people are posting. And they have people going through all of these posts, and I'm sure it's a mix of technology and people, but when you think of the scale of 1 billion people and trying to monitor at a post level what people are doing, that's a lot of people. And so I could see where Twitter, based on what we know from the Twitter files, in terms of how they were just trying to block accounts and limit the freedom of information, that there was obviously a lot of staff that were deployed across looking at posts and deciding if that was the type of information that they wanted to have on Twitter. So I could see a case where there would be a large staff doing that, based on looking at what's happening in a country like China, where they are really trying to monitor free speech.
I think they're doing a fair bit of that in Russia as well, actually. But that's a very good point. I mean, you can imagine that most of the 6,500 people that left, if they were involved in, for lack of a better word, let's call it large-scale censorship activities, then then they may not have been based in the office, right? But let's assume for the moment, and this may not be accurate, it really depends on what roles they played, but they had an average income of $100,000, just to make the math simple. If you're dealing with a company that's been losing money, and it's intermittently, it's more like it's intermittently made a lot of money, and then the other years not so much at all. But if they lost only $200 million in 2021, and you cut, $65 million out of it, 6,500 times 100,000. Now all of a sudden the ship is sailing clear, right? You don't have that overhead anymore. Now I wonder how much of that sales is also very dangerous, especially in the world of digital, because while there is lots to be done in terms of direct media sales and partnership deals and this sort of thing, of which I know that Twitter's engaged in much of, the vast majority of that's going to be programmatic revenue. And programmatic revenue should be a relatively, it really places a lot of the onus on the control of what's going on over on the side of the actual buyer through something like the Trade Desk or a similar platform. So the cost of selling and operating and basically fulfilling those orders is quite a bit different if it's programmatic versus if it's a direct sale. Now you can set up private networks and private marketplaces and these sorts of things and lots of deals in that respect, but you're not selling individual ads. These have to be big scale level projects that they're involved in generating revenue with direct sales. So I don't know. I can imagine that a good portion of these people are probably from the sort of censorship side of things, the content management side of it, shall we say?
Yes, and and now because it's a private company, and when he's been asked about the profitability, he says he doesn't care. He's more concerned with this being a place of freedom of speech versus profitability. So again, because it's a private company, it's up to him what happens, or whoever the investors are with him in that company. But if it was a publicly traded company or it was about to IPO, it wouldn't be seen the same way. So, that would be unacceptable. It would need to be profitable, and they would need to see a clear plan on how that's going to be profitable. So I'm not 100% clear on what his plan is in the future. I think it's interesting with this rebrand because he said right from the beginning that this had a bigger play than just being Twitter, that this was going to be integrated into a new model, and that it would be just a part of that model. And so I think that what it's going to be in this new model is yet to be seen. But I think that this rebranding is a sign that he is committed to that vision, and he's going to move forward with the plan. And we've seen him take lots of plans and make them successful in different industries. So if anybody can do it, he can do it. And the fact that he has the ability to do it at his pace is making it more realistic that it can happen, because he makes those decisions, not shareholders.
It's very interesting because as you're talking about this, it's very apparent that the operation on its own, if you are shooting for sustainability, you are going to right the ship financially. He's done that. You're probably going to integrate it with something else where it can add value. If he's looking at doing that, the rebranding could be that first kind of reveal of where this is headed. If you were going to package this up and resell Twitter, you wouldn't want to lose that brand name. You wouldn't want to
exactly.
You wouldn't want to let that go. You'd want to maintain that and allow whoever acquires it next to do whatever they want with it. You wouldn't want to mess with it. Leave it pretty much as it is, and that's not what's happening at all. But I do want to tap onto something you've mentioned here, and it came up in our call with Rachel the other day. It came up with our interview with Rachel the other day, Rachel Jacobson, which is purpose. And if you look at any of his businesses, they have a very clear societal benefit, a real purpose behind them. Now, you can argue whether or not it's fulfilling the promise that he's claiming it's making. There's lots of good arguments about whether or not electric cars are actually, result in better situations than cars that require carbon-based fuel. But that's kind of beside the point. Tesla aims to reduce the automotive industry's dependence or eliminate its dependence on carbon-based fuels. SpaceX, let's make the human race a multiplanetary society. It's an interesting concept. I'm not sure really what the end benefit is unless we really scorch this earth, but there is reason to be explored there. The Boring Company, which, for lack of a better way to frame it, is starting out with trying to solve the problems of traffic in LA, which could you pick a better city to tackle that? These are all very large, complex operations, but they have very specific goals in mind. And freedom of speech, as you mentioned, is certainly something that he believes in. It's a strong societal value. I think it's been under a fair bit of attack lately, but it's become very a divisive concept. But in practice, it is something that democratic society is based on freedom of speech and requires freedom of speech. So there is a societal benefit to something like that. And, I'm not sure exactly where Twitter falls into, or the new X will fall into, the social media landscape. They do, in their disclosures, in their financial statements, they identify their competitors as being, Meta and Google or Alphabet, and a variety of others that are in, large players in the social media space. And that's where they used to see themselves in competing. So you're competing with the big boys in a big market. Mm-hmm. I wonder what the competitive set will look like in the future for this product, especially if it becomes a much more focused platform.
Well, yes, and you look at if you take something like Alphabet, they've certainly expanded way beyond search and, into autonomous cars, into phones, and almost into just like Elon Musk, they're in all different types of areas too. Mm-hmm. And so, and I think Meta's going that direction too. And it makes sense. I mean, given the fact that they have to make more and more profits and expand, that's just part of that expansion. And when you're that size, you can afford to delve into these other areas and make a social impact. So I think that it's right to, even for now, just in social, I think it's the right competitors, but even for the future, those are looking like the main competitors. They don't look like they're going anywhere. They've maintained their business and grown their business over time, where we've seen a lot of tech companies fall by the wayside. So I think these are the main players. And, just going back to the freedom of speech example. So I really think that one of the things that Elon is really holding to be one of the most important parts of what Twitter represents. And I want to give you a couple of examples. So RFK Jr., who's running for the Democrats, has really been positioned in the media as a anti-vax conspiracist, right? Mm-hmm. And they've used that to discredit him and to really get people to focus on the fact of the conspiracy, the vaccine conspiracy. Now, I've spent considerable time listening to interviews with him, and I think that it would be a great miss for the American people not to give him a chance to have a voice. But what in fact is happening is that voice is being taken away. So there was an interview with Jordan Peterson and RFK Jr. on YouTube that was basically taken off. And so what you're seeing more and more around RFK Jr. is these platforms, Meta and Alphabet, Google specifically in YouTube, are removing that content from their networks. And so this is the only place that you're going to be able to see that content. Same with Tucker Carlson. Where did he show up? He showed up on Twitter. And the movie Sound of Freedom, again, that was basically a small movie with a very important story that nobody. Amazon wouldn't pick it up. Netflix wouldn't pick up. For 5 years, they're trying to find a distributor. Nobody would pick it up because it was about human trafficking and specifically children. And it's based on a true story. And it was a $10 million budget, and it essentially did better than Indiana Jones in the opening weekend and had limited release and a much more limited budget. But the people went out of their way to see it and find it, even though media would not speak about it. And in fact, when they did speak about it, they painted it as a QAnon or conspiracy theory, or it was because the only company that they could find to distribute it was a Christian-based production company. That now they try and paint it as a Christian focused movie, which, sure, okay. I mean, there's not really any Christian doctrine in it, but because the production company was a Christian-based company, they've painted it as that. So they've done everything they can to try and build up a bad opinion of these films. But all of that to say that I think that Twitter has shown over and over again that this is a platform that isn't going to block people, and Elon has been very clear about this, that give people, the American people, the world people, a chance to decide for themselves.
It's a global problem, right? And, what's really interesting about what you said, talk about an easy way to introduce an important competitive advantage. You won't be censored. We can allow discourse to happen. I mean, one of the concerns, we've touched on this in previous issues as well, is that we have these extremes in the political sphere and not a lot of meaningful dialogue, lots of divisive tactics being used on both sides, not a lot of meaningful dialogue between them. Mm-hmm. People need the ability to express themselves and then have discussions around those expressions. If we have a platform here that allows that, that has a genuine societal benefit. Mm-hmm. And I think that's an interesting aspect of this. So we have a clear sense of purpose here. Like it's not without its purpose. And I'm really curious about the comments you mentioned about it being kind of integrated into some other part of his ecosystem. I don't know what that could look like, and maybe we'll see what that looks like. But I wonder if this speaks to another area here that I'm curious about, which is the business model they're involved in. Mm-hmm. And not that I think this business model would completely go away, but very clearly it's let's get a big audience, let's monetize the big audience. Basically, get a lot of people involved in this platform and we're going to sell ads against that audience. I'm kind of curious where they're going to go with the ethics of this. They could evolve into a media company, more broadly.
Yeah.
When I've looked at kind of Instagram and TikTok, we had TikTok come into the office and do a presentation, and they very clearly identify themselves as an entertainment business. Mm-hmm. And they have programs to compensate, creators, at least in the US, they were trying to get something going in Canada too, to help them create content that's going to be entertaining for people. That's their primary purpose. Whereas, Instagram is still a little bit more tied to Facebook's, like, we're trying to create connections between people. And, this is my life. And, I may not share that publicly. I may share that just a group of people that I know. Whereas TikTok is very much more an entertainment platform. We're talking about a movie that can't get picked up. I don't know what would stop Twitter from introducing a business where it allowed the distribution and monetization of other forms of content. The ethical question will come down to the advertising model that it uses going forward. Advertisers not all advertisers, but this is the tension that exists in media, right? Advertisers want to have their message as sleekly integrated into regular media content as possible. Think about this as the equivalent of product placements in a movie. Did Coke put a can of Coke in Keanu Reeves' hands in that movie, or did they just choose to use Coke in that movie? You'll never know. You'll never know whether that was a product placement or whether it was just happenstance. In media, we do sponsored content, and of course there has been lots of discussion around native content, which is content presented, paid content that delivers a specific advertiser message in a means that looks like neutral editorial. And I do think that's an unethical thing to do. And the counterpoint to that is whether or not you're doing something to specifically tell users or audiences, ignore this content, it's paid. If the content is paid and it's labeled paid and it's clear, it's not unethical in that respect, and it delivers value to the audience, it'll get consumed. It has to be good content and in the right place, and there's a lot of other factors in there, but ultimately, content that is identified as being paid would be something quite, that's the ethical side of that versus just slipping it in as a native piece. Twitter is already used very aggressively for propaganda globally. I follow a guy named Ryan Macbeth who covers intelligence in the U.S. Around the Army and military operations, and he kind of explains a lot of things in layman's terms to people who are interested, and he's covered the war in Ukraine fairly substantially, so I've watched a lot of that. But his comment was that Russian propagandists are actively using platforms like Twitter and Facebook to put their messages across as if they were legitimate thoughts of regular people when they're really actually state-sanctioned, purposeful delivery of messaging. And I don't know, aside from teaching our children how to identify bad sources, it becomes really hard to kind of eliminate some of that. But the ethical shift would be for Twitter to monetize that more directly. And, Facebook moved to a pay-to-play model fairly quickly when it came to content. Twitter doesn't really have that in its cards, or X doesn't have that in its cards right now outside of its blue check marks, which, that program is now it's a bit of a laughingstock. But it's an interesting problem for them. But clearly they're in the midst of having to decide what kind of business they're going to be structurally and what the business model they're going to employ. Because, after 12 years, Twitter could, I don't want to say barely, because $1.2 million in profit is not insubstantial, but following 12 years of losses and succeeding by subsequent losses after the fact, not a really strong signal. So it is possible that the advertising model of I've got a big audience, I can just advertise to them, it's not enough on its own to sustain an operation like Twitter. So they have to explore alternatives to kind of bring stability to the mix. And if you have complete freedom of speech, you may not have a brand safe environment.
Yeah.
Right?
I think
that's what's going on at Facebook and Google and YouTube, and they're trying to ensure that their environment is a place that's comfortable for advertisers to be.
yes, and which is now sort of tilting another direction, which is the argument is that it caters too much to what the advertisers want, and that that can curb freedom of speech. And so I think that with Twitter, the challenge is as soon as Elon Musk took over, they lost people. There was people that just don't like Elon Musk and feel that that he doesn't represent their agenda.
Yeah.
And so there was loss of audience there. Also, he went in and he cleaned out a lot of fake accounts, which also drove down the size of the audience. So you look at the audience is being reduced in its scale. And then on top of that, it's not like a publicly traded company that has a board and it's not one person making all the decisions. This is one person making all the decisions. So that's very concerning too for advertisers, because it isn't a balanced approach. It's one person's opinion and they control the company. So that's also going to impact it. And again, just this whole freedom of speech, businesses may have a problem with that. And I'll give another example. So there was a movie by Matt Walsh and the Daily Wire called What is a Woman? And it got right into the gender the gender discussion. And it was Elon, and it escapes me the person's name. They hired a new safety man, like a C-level safety and community type of executive that was responsible for just when the whole freedom of speech thing was really getting to its high point. He brought this person in to give it a bit more of a reputation of having some sort of control of what was on the platform. Now, when this movie was coming out, there was a deal that was to have the movie broadcast on the platform. This C-level representative killed it. And then Elon, and then they left literally like the day or the next day after. And then after that, the movie was then broadcast on Twitter. And I believe that it has over 100 million views. And so...
is it just me, or is Twitter sort of a lightning rod for angry people with right-wing opinions? It seems to have really sunken in there. Not that I necessarily... I agree with some of that stuff and disagree with some of that stuff, but I don't hear as much about the left taking advantage of it. So like from a sustainability side of things, I would be concerned about trying to make sure the platform is attractive to both sides of that conversation, to keep that interaction going, even keeping, like from a business standpoint, and this is kind of horrible from a cultural standpoint, but even keeping the fight going. So there's a place for the fight and there's an audience watching the fight. You kind of need that as a business. Otherwise, it's just a bunch of people who agree with each other, talking to each other, which is not very interesting to watch. So I do kind of question whether or not, so freedom of speech being critical, I think, to a democratic society, I do question whether or not there's a really clear commercial application there. Because Twitter had previously tried to like hone it, although they were pretty hard on the far right, and now they're wide open, which is a very interesting shift to make from a customer standpoint, because you get behavioral shifts among customers, right? And they're adapting to it.
So you're saying the before he took over, you're saying it was leans towards the far right?
After,
yes, because I know before, one of the things that Elon was saying that he was cleaning out was all this sort of pro-woke, pro-liberal slant that just seemed to be completely the other way. And now you're saying it's seen as a right-leaning platform now, which is interesting. I mean,
at least at the moment, there seems to be that activity, right?
Well, I think, here's the bigger thing, right? When you look at America now and how divided it is, and it's literally so black and white, you've got to be either on one side or the other side. You can't be in the middle anymore. You have to choose a side. And I think this is how it's playing out in media, right? So, you've got platforms that are deciding, okay, this is the consensus of what, culture thinks is acceptable at this point. Here's our position on the vaccination. Here's our position on this. Here's our position on that. And the argument is, and this isn't me, this is just the argument that's been put forward, is that there's just there's that one view, and then there's no other voices. And so this again is adding that other voice to the conversation. And to your point of democracy, you have to have all different types of conversations and thoughts. You can't just suppress thoughts you don't like and then call that a democracy.
Yeah.
I mean, the bravest democracy is one that allows people to speak their mind up until a point. I think we all would agree on both sides that there's a certain point where things are unacceptable, right? And I think any company that we're discussing would say, yes, we know there's just some certain things that we all agree that are unacceptable. But in that other spectrum of discussion, I think that it's so important to have other, to see all the different opinions and to allow us to make our own opinions. And so I think that that's what we're seeing played out right now with these social media platforms.
I wonder if there's going to be a broader change with respect to culture and advertising, because if Google and Alphabet and Meta are putting so much energy into a brand safe environment by mitigating the content that may be considered offensive, and Twitter's doing very little or none of that, you'd think that there might be a disconnect between advertisers and their demand and the environment that Twitter then exists as, where it has far less of that kind of censorship. It could be a very brand unsafe environment in some respects. But if that environment is something that the broader societal norms accept, then it's going to also be something that advertisers accept. So perhaps the threat to the model, the advertising-based business model, isn't as bad as one would think. Although I really think that they have to make sure that they do have the complete discussion, not just one side. I mean, so this is the other thing that happens with one business model. You might find, well, I have a certain segment of the audience who wants to do one thing, certain segment of customers that need something else. I have to create two separate products for them. I can't create one product to satisfy both of them. Part of the challenge with something like this is, can Twitter or X properly straddle a broad enough group of interests to allow that conversation to continue, or not just become another echo chamber of people who have one point of view talking to each other about it, and everybody else knowing that that's what's going on over there. And so if you don't want that, you don't go there. Mm-hmm. And I think that's the risk of polarizing people too much, and catering to one group versus the other. As you mentioned, so many media companies simply pick a side and they just go with that. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I would love to see much more neutrality in journalism and much more neutrality in online discourse. And if I had to hedge as a business leader as to whether I would go niche or broad on this is a situation where I think if you go niche, like let's say they go right into like, well, we're going to be the channel, the place for right-wing people to talk to each other. Let's just say they did that. We've got the Daily Wire, we got all the Ben Shapiro's, and we got the Jordan Petersons, we got that group, and anybody who wants to talk to those people, this is the place for them. That's a niche strategy, right? It's like I'm taking one political view and I'm serving that set of customers in a particular kind of way. So is that a sustainable strategy? I don't think so, because at some point there's no more conversation to have. It's more outrage about the same set of issues, perhaps, or there's just that becomes no longer a dominant profile in terms of the way people are thinking about things. So let's imagine this sort of last 5 years of polarization starts to evaporate and something happens and it brings everybody together, right? What are the kinds of things that do that? Wars, economic downturns, massive prosperity based on X, Y, and Z, like major cultural things will then bring these two disparate ends closer together. And if that were to happen, and there's always a chance that can happen, it could quickly become irrelevant. And they'd have to pivot very aggressively. I think they really, if the purpose is free speech, they really need to make sure they've got the complete spectrum of people engaged in this platform in order for it to be sustainable over time.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And we've discussed in previous episodes media consumption behaviors and how they've changed and where people are getting their news from. And so the control of a few large networks having control over all the information is not the case anymore with social media, or even personalities. Like somebody like Joe Rogan is as big of a personality, or Tucker Carlson is as big of a brand as CNN. And so, that's changed the landscape because it's not a broadcast model as much as it was anymore. And then that's sliced all the way down to the long tail of small little voices that have, more and more extreme views on things. So that media landscape is completely changed, and it's not just in the domain of a few large networks anymore. And so I think that we've already seen such enormous change, and obviously more will change. And so I think that these businesses have been very good, and when I mean businesses, Meta and Alphabet have been very good at pivoting and changing with the times. And I think that what they have so much data. They know what the cultural zeitgeist is. They know what people want. They can see it in real time, and then they can develop products based on those insights, which is very interesting. So I think they're perfectly positioned to do that, and maybe that's one of the reasons why Elon wanted to get into a platform like that with so much data and historical data that could be leveraged. Because really that's what they're selling versus just eyeballs.
Yeah. There's definitely a data play in there for sure. All right, let's bring this into some kind of a closing.
Sure.
So sustainability, very much a function of a business delivering consistent profitability year over year, and maintaining a positive outlook, maintaining competitive advantage over time, and successfully navigating those changes to the business model that might occur as a result of disruptions that involve cost, competition, technology, and of course customer behavior, which we've talked a lot about with respect to Twitter. Obviously, maintaining a large audience is going to be essential to its long-term success. Alongside, of course, maintaining a monetization model for that audience where they can continue to drive revenue based on that. Now, Twitter may be on track now, or at least is starting to head on track. Let's assume the ship has been righted financially. There are still some open questions as to where this is going to go, and I think the rebranding definitely speaks to that, because we know that they've had a pretty checkered past financially. As exciting as the product is in all of its communications glory, as a media product or as a messaging platform, depending on how you look at it, it's substantial, but of course, it's not clear that its future is secure yet. The jury is still out on where Twitter is going to land. It does seem like something like $650 million of costs have been pulled out of the operation, which should bring it back to some level of profitability, providing it can maintain the level of revenue and the user base that it's got. But we're probably not going to see for a little while yet as to where this is going to go and where it's going to fit into Elon's overall portfolio.
Mm-hmm. Well, I would just say in Elon we trust. I think that, with what he's done with his other businesses, I think if anybody's got a shot of making this work, it's him. And it'll be really interesting to see where he takes this, especially if he's integrating it with his other businesses, because he's created such interesting businesses, and he's been successful over and over with businesses. So if anybody can take on this challenge, it's Elon. So it'll be interesting to watch.
Very cool. Thank you very much. Thank you everyone for watching. We'll be back again in another week or two with another episode of Leadership Unscripted. Have a great day, and we'll talk to you soon.
Thanks, everyone.